Tony Jeffries, the Olympian and former pro boxer, recently announced that although he took up Jiu Jitsu and got promoted through to blue belt, he is unfortunately going to have to step away from Jiu Jitsu completely. And that is due to injuries he's sustained on his neck, which is then creating issues with the nerves, radiating out to the right side of his body. Now, it sounds like quite the ordeal that Tony went through. He tried a number of different protocols to try to alleviate the problem in his neck, and nothing really completely solved the problem. So he made that difficult decision to just completely step away from jiu-jitsu. I recommend you hear it directly from his mouth in his video. But as somebody who's done both judo and boxing, and then some jiu-jitsu / MMA, I wanted to comment on one of the things that Tony said, which is that he took 100% responsibility for this injury. And then he mentioned, perhaps not tapping soon enough for a choke, or just being a little bit stubborn about tapping. And this is what I have to say about that aspect of the submission game, whether it's judo or jiu-jitsu. First off, in terms of a choke, nobody's really supposed to be putting pressure on your neck. What they're trying to do is cut off the blood flow in your carotid artery to just stop the blood flow to your brain, so you just shut off. That's not going to put pressure on the spinal cord. What I suspect is really more, it's just the grinding of people trying to maybe neck crank Tony, or just put pressure on his neck as they're trying to turn him, or maybe he wound up putting a little pressure on his own neck as they're trying to. But here's the one thing I did notice from doing jiu-jitsu, as basically the smallest person on the mat and a female, surprise, is that unfortunately in today's generation of so-called combat sport athletes, it's now acceptable for larger males to take advantage of smaller individuals, such as myself. And I've been. Now, this really annoying phenomenon seemed to have just taken off during and post-COVID, where you'd have a lot of wannabe fellows who've never done any sport ever in their entire life. They walk into an MMA place or maybe a jiu-jitsu place, and then they decide that they're going to become an MMA fighter. But they have no context for sport, for practice versus competition. They have very little coordination. They have very little control over their body. And so, unfortunately, what winds up happening is if you grapple or boxing spar or kickboxing spar with one of these individuals, they're just spastics, and they have these notions of grandeur. So what happens? They try to find the lowest common denominator, in this case, perhaps a small female like myself, and they have no bones whatsoever about just imposing their size and gender advantage in terms of, what's supposed to be a for fun sparring or grappling session, right? Like, it's obviously, we're not in the same weight division. We're not in the same gender division. We're not going to compete. But they got something to prove to themselves, so they figure they'll go for it. So, for example, I've been neck cranked by dudes who are 250 pounds. Completely uncalled for, right? But they were absolute beginners. I've also been hit a little bit too hard by guys who are also 250 pounds, completely uncalled for. So here's what I suspect happened with Tony. Even though he said he takes 100% of the responsibility, I suspect he was more than likely injured by an overeager, slightly spastic, slightly overambitious white belt, or 2 or 3 or 4. He was probably not subjected to a lot of torque on his neck by brown belts and black belts, because they're not going to do that. They're just going to rely on skill, technique, and being super loose. They're not going to apply a lot of pressure to someone's neck, because they know that, one, that's just not cool, and 2, it could injure them. I think Tony Jeffries also has the added sort of disadvantage of being a real true trophy for these super over aspiring white belts, because they know he's an Olympic boxer. They know he's a former professional boxer. So if they can make him tap, it's a real, badge of honor for them to go brag to their buddies about, I made this Olympic boxer tap. I just cranked him, So that's my hypothesis about why Tony sustained this neck injury. But those of you guys who practice jiu-jitsu or combat sports, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear about it in the comments.